more women are expected to file for bankruptcy than graduate from college this year.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty startling statistic, isn't it? And that's the reality we're going to be exploring in this deep dive,
Yeah.
focusing specifically on the financial pressures that so many single mothers are facing today.
Right. And it really reflects a very dramatic shift
Yeah,
in the economic landscape for families in general, but single mothers in particular.
absolutely. And making ends meet is just getting harder and harder,
Yeah.
even for households with two incomes.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to uncover some tough realities, but we're also going to be digging into potential solutions, both individual and societal.
That's great.
And to guide our deep dive today, we're turning to a really fascinating book called The Two-Income Trap by Elizabeth Warren and Amelia Warren Tyagi.
I'm familiar.
Oh, you're familiar with this one. Okay,
Yeah.
great. So you already kind of know where we're headed with this. This book really dives deep into the economic pressures that are squeezing middle-class families.
It does.
Especially single mothers.
And it's a powerful lens to examine how the rules of the economic game have changed and how those changes disproportionately impact families, particularly those headed by single mothers.
Yeah, and something that really surprised me when I was reading this book was this fact that single mothers are now the demographic group that is most likely to file for bankruptcy.
Is that right?
More than the elderly, more than minorities, anyone.
Wow.
That wasn't always the case, was it?
No, it wasn't. And a generation ago,
Right.
the bankruptcy rate for single mothers wasn't significantly different from other groups.
Really?
What we've seen is a staggering increase, over 600% in just a few decades.
That's mind-blowing. I mean, especially when you consider the strides that women have made in education, in the workforce.
Right.
You'd think that they would be more financially secure, not less.
Absolutely.
What's driving this alarming trend? What's going on?
Well, a big factor is the cost of housing,
Okay.
particularly in neighborhoods with good school districts.
Oh, yeah.
So single mothers are often caught in this impossible bind. They need to live in these areas.
To give their kids the best.
To give their kids access to quality education.
Yeah.
But the competition for housing in these areas drives the prices sky high.
Yeah.
So it's like a bidding war.
Oh, wow.
That leaves so many single mothers just struggling to keep a roof over their heads.
So it's not even just the price tag, it's the pressure they face.
Exactly.
To, as a single mother trying to provide the best for their child.
Right.
It seems almost predatory in a way.
Absolutely. And it's not just housing, the cost of living across the board.
Sure.
Healthcare, childcare, education has skyrocketed.
Yeah.
So these essential expenses leave many single mothers with almost no financial wiggle room.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the core concept of the two-income trap.
Okay, so help us understand this trap. What does it mean for families, and why is it so precarious, specifically for single mothers?
Okay, so the two-income trap basically describes the situation where families become reliant on two incomes just to maintain their basic standard of living. So when one income disappears due to divorce, job loss, illness, the entire structure collapses.
Yeah.
They're left trying to cover those same expenses with only one paycheck.
That's a recipe for disaster. It seems like the system itself is setting these families up for failure.
Right.
But what about child support? Shouldn't fathers be stepping up to the plate more to help single mothers avoid these financial cliffs?
Well, there's a lot of debate around that question.
Yeah.
And it's more nuanced than it might seem at first glance.
Okay.
So let's unpack the arguments for and against increased child support.
Yeah.
And see what the data actually tells us.
Let's do it, because this feels like a conversation that needs to happen.
Absolutely. Well, first, it's important to look at what's actually happening with child support payments. The data shows that the vast majority of middle-class fathers are, in fact, paying the child support that is mandated by the courts.
So that kind of challenges the perception that a lot of fathers are just not contributing at all.
And while there were certainly cases where fathers failed to meet their obligations,
Sure.
it's not as widespread as some might believe.
Interesting.
And what often gets overlooked is that many fathers, even those who are consistently making payments, are grappling with their own financial challenges.
Yeah.
They may be living high on the hog.
Exactly right.
Right.
So just demanding higher child support payments might not be a realistic solution.
Especially if those fathers are already stretched thin.
Exactly.
Okay.
Increased child support isn't a magic bullet.
Yeah, This is making a lot of sense.
And there's also the increasing prevalence of shared custody.
Well, that's interesting. How does that play into it?
Arrangements to consider. Yeah. How does shared custody impact the financial picture for both parents?
Well, joint custody, while often beneficial for the children involved, can create added financial complexity.
Okay.
For fathers, it often means reduced child support payments,
Okay.
but increased expenses related to maintaining two homes for the children.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought about that.
For mothers,
Yeah.
it can mean juggling work and childcare schedules
Oh, yeah.
in ways that can strain their earning capacity.
So it's not a simple equation of, dad pays more, problem solved. It's a
Right.
lot more complex than that.
It's a web of interconnected financial pressures
Yeah.
that need to be addressed more holistically.
And we need to be looking at all sides of the equation.
Absolutely.
Great
And
stuff.
and focusing solely on child support payments ignores the larger economic forces at play.
Right.
And there's another major contributor
Okay.
to the financial strain on families.
What's that?
And it's something that the two-income trap spends a lot of time dissecting: the explosion of easy credit.
Yeah, this was a huge shift.
It was,
The book talks about how, just a generation ago,
right?
families couldn't even get into the kind of debt that's so commonplace today.
It's almost unimaginable now, right?
It is.
Getting a loan used to be a big deal.
Yeah.
Banks had to actually assess risk,
Right.
not just push out loans like candy.
And there were these things called usury laws,
Right.
which I feel like nobody even knows about anymore,
Right.
that actually place limits on how much interest lenders could charge.
Exactly. And it made predatory lending
Less profitable.
less profitable.
So it wasn't as appealing,
Right.
but then came deregulation.
Oh, yeah.
And that seems to be at the root of so many economic problems.
Well,
What exactly happened, and how did it pave the way for this current debt crisis that we're in?
deregulation essentially stripped away many of the safeguards
Okay.
that protected consumers from predatory lending.
Hmm.
So regulations that limited how much interest lenders could charge were rolled back. Rules that required banks to carefully vet borrowers were loosened.
So basically, they just opened the floodgates and said,
Exactly.
So,
It led to a flood of easy credit, with lenders aggressively marketing
oh, yeah.
high-interest loans and credit cards often targeting
Of course.
those who are already struggling financially.
It just feels almost insidious.
It was.
Like these families are already facing all of this pressure,
Right.
and then they're bombarded with all of these, tempting offers and things that seem like a lifeline, but ultimately just drag them further into debt.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
Subprime mortgages, for example, were heavily marketed
Okay.
to families with poor credit histories.
Mm-hmm.
These loans came with extremely high interest rates and hidden fees, making them incredibly risky.
Yeah. And the book points out that even families who could have qualified for better rates
Right.
were often steered towards these predatory loans.
It was a systemic problem.
Mm.
Mortgage brokers were incentivized to push these high-cost loans
Why?
because they received larger commissions from the lenders.
No, so it's all about the money.
The entire system was geared towards maximizing profit.
Ugh, this is where I get fired up.
Yeah.
Knowing that this is how the system was designed
Right?
to exploit people, what can we do to fight back?
Well,
What solutions does the book offer to protect families from these predatory practices?
the two-income trap highlights several potential solutions.
Okay, let's hear them.
One idea is to reinstate those usury laws
Oh,
we talked about.
I like that idea.
By capping interest rates, we can make predatory lending far less profitable
Yes.
and protect families from falling into these debt traps.
That just seems like a no-brainer to me.
It does.
Why did we ever get rid of those?
Good question.
What else can we do to rein in this out-of-control lending industry?
Well, another crucial step is to implement stricter regulations
Okay.
across the lending industry.
Okay.
We need clear rules that curb unfair lending practices and empower consumers with the information they need
Right.
to make informed decisions.
So it seems like we need to go back to the basics.
Yeah.
Like to a time when lenders were actually held accountable
Absolutely.
for their actions.
And beyond regulations,
Yeah.
we need to prioritize financial literacy,
Okay.
equipping people with the knowledge and skills
Yeah.
to understand debt interest rates and responsible borrowing can empower them to make sound financial choices.
Yeah, that's what I love about this show and about these deep dives is like knowledge is power, right?
Exactly.
The more we understand about how the system works, the less likely we are to be exploited by it.
That's right. We can't just rely on individual responsibility
Right.
when the system itself is designed to push people into debt.
Yeah, it's not a level playing field.
It's not. We need systemic solutions
Yeah.
alongside individual empowerment.
And speaking of the system, the two-income trap also dives into kind of the political side
Yes.
of this whole issue.
It does.
And there's a fascinating story about Elizabeth Warren meeting with Hillary Clinton to discuss a pro-creditor bankruptcy bill that I just found really eye-opening.
That anecdote is a powerful illustration of how lobbying can influence political decisions, even those that directly impact families that are struggling to stay afloat.
Can you just remind our listeners what happened in that meeting?
Okay, so Elizabeth Warren, at the time, was a Harvard law professor specializing in bankruptcy. Met with then First Lady Hillary Clinton to express her concerns about a proposed bankruptcy bill. This bill would make it much more difficult for families to file for bankruptcy and get relief from crushing debt.
So it seemed like Clinton was initially receptive to Warren's arguments?
She was.
Like her staff was even prepared to fight against the bill?
Yes, but then the banking industry got involved.
And by got involved, you mean?
They opened their wallets.
Ah, so that's how it works.
The banking industry poured massive campaign contributions into Clinton's Senate campaign, and her position on the bankruptcy bill suddenly shifted.
And she voted for it.
She ended up voting in favor of the bill, which ultimately made it much harder for families to get debt relief.
It's just a stark reminder of how money can warp the political process, even when the well-being of families is at stake.
It's disheartening, but it also underscores the importance of understanding how these systems work and how we can advocate for change.
Absolutely. We can't just be passive observers. We need to engage in the political process. Hold our leaders accountable and demand policies that actually prioritize the well-being of families.
Absolutely.
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about what individuals can do to protect themselves from falling into this two-income trap. The book introduces a really practical exercise that they call a financial fire drill. Have you ever done one of these?
I have.
And
I highly recommend it.
Really?
It's a powerful way for families to assess their financial vulnerabilities and create a plan for handling potential emergencies.
So walk us through this fire drill. What are the key steps?
Okay, so the fire drill involves asking yourself 3 crucial questions. The first question is, can your family survive?
Ooh, that's a scary one.
Without one income?
Yeah, that's the question that keeps so many families up at night.
It is, and the reality is job loss is a common experience. The two-income trap points out that the average family has a 1 in 6 chance of experiencing a job loss in any given year.
That's a pretty high statistic.
It is. So it's essential to think through how you would handle that financial shock.
So if the answer to that first question is a terrifying no, what's the next step in this financial fire drill?
That leads us to the second question. Can you downshift your fixed expenses?
So we're talking about those big recurring expenses that just eat up a huge chunk of our budgets.
Housing, transportation, insurance, childcare.
Yeah.
These are the big ones.
Right.
Could you downsize to a more affordable home?
Yeah.
Could you get by with one car or find a more fuel-efficient option? Could you switch to a less expensive health insurance plan?
Yeah.
Could you explore alternative childcare arrangements?
These are tough questions.
They are.
But necessary ones.
But necessary ones.
It's about creating that safety net, that breathing room.
Exactly.
In case that second income disappears.
By minimizing those fixed expenses, you create more financial flexibility and resilience.
Okay, so what's the third question?
The third and final question in the fire drill is, what is your emergency backup plan?
So this is where we get into the what ifs.
Exactly.
What if you or your partner lose your job?
What if someone gets sick and you face mounting medical bills?
What if you get divorced and suddenly have to support yourself and your kids on a single income?
It's not about being pessimistic. It's about being prepared.
It's like having a fire escape route planned out. You know, you hope you never need it. But you're incredibly grateful for it if you do.
That's a great analogy. The key is to think through these scenarios and create a concrete plan for how you would manage them financially.
This is fantastic advice for families who are relatively stable right now.
Right.
But what about those who are already in the midst
That's a great question.
of a financial crisis?
Yeah.
You know, they might not have the luxury of downsizing or building up emergency savings.
Right.
What does the book offer for those families who are already struggling?
You're raising a really important point.
Yeah.
The two-income trap doesn't shy away from the difficult realities
Okay, good.
that many families face.
So what do they say?
For those already in financial distress, the book offers some compassionate and practical advice.
I like that.
The first piece of advice is simple but profound.
Okay.
Avoid the blame game.
It's so easy to get caught in that cycle of blame, isn't it?
It is.
Blaming ourselves, blaming our partners, feeling like we failed somehow.
But as the book points out, most families end up in financial trouble.
Right.
Because of external factors.
Things outside of our control.
Not personal failings, job loss, medical emergencies, divorce. These are often circumstances beyond our control.
So the first step is to acknowledge that we're in a tough situation and it's not our fault.
Exactly.
Then
it is about focusing on what you can control.
Okay.
The book emphasizes the importance of holding on to your treasures.
And by treasures, they mean?
The essential things that bring your family security and stability.
Okay.
Housing, transportation, healthcare.
Yeah.
The absolute basics.
Right.
Prioritize those expenses above all else. If necessary, be willing to let go of non-essentials to protect those treasures.
So making strategic choices even when it feels like everything is falling apart.
And if the situation becomes truly dire, the book recommends seeking legal advice and exploring options like bankruptcy.
Bankruptcy, you know, it often carries such a stigma.
It does.
But it can be a lifeline for families that are just drowning in debt.
It's not a decision to take lightly.
Of course not.
But it can provide a fresh start and a chance to rebuild.
I like that the two-income trap also devotes a section to what they call guilt-free default.
Yes.
What does that mean?
So this is about understanding your rights.
Okay.
And not feeling obligated to repay debts that have been legally discharged in bankruptcy.
Okay.
It's about pushing back against the pressure tactics.
Because they'll often try to make you feel like you still owe that money.
They do.
Even though it's been legally wiped away.
It's true. They'll threaten to damage your credit score, harass you with phone calls, even try to repossess your belongings.
Really?
But you have to know your rights and stand firm.
So it's about reclaiming your power and focusing on what truly matters, the well-being of your family.
Exactly.
This conversation has really opened my eyes to the complexities of this issue.
Good.
But it's also sparked some questions for me.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about the impact on adults.
Right.
But what happens to the children when families are struggling financially?
You're so right to bring that up.
Yeah.
It's a crucial part of the conversation.
It is.
That often gets overlooked.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers.
Yeah.
You know, the policies.
Right.
But we can't forget about the human side.
Yeah, the human cost of this.
Of this crisis.
Like, what does it actually feel like for these kids growing up in families that are constantly struggling?
Imagine being a child and sensing the tension in your home. The hushed conversations about bills.
Right.
The worry etched on your parents' faces.
Yeah.
It creates this underlying current of anxiety.
Right.
That can be really hard to escape.
And it's not just about the atmosphere either, right?
Right.
Like, these kids are often forced to make sacrifices because of their family's financial situation.
Maybe they can't participate in extracurricular activities because of the cost.
Yeah.
Or maybe they have to wear hand-me-down clothes that don't quite fit.
Right.
These might seem like small things to adults.
Yeah.
But to a child, they can be incredibly significant.
Yeah.
It can impact their self-esteem, their sense of belonging.
It's like they're being robbed of a carefree childhood.
Right.
What's even more troubling is that this experience can have long-lasting consequences.
That's one of the most concerning aspects of this issue.
Yeah.
Studies have shown that children who grow up in financially stressed families are more likely to experience mental health problems, have difficulty in school, and struggle with relationships later in life.
So it's not just about, you know, getting by in the moment.
No, it's not.
It's about these ripple effects that can impact a child's entire trajectory.
And it's not just about individual families either.
Right.
When large segments of the population are struggling financially, it has broader societal implications.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure.
How does this financial strain on families impact society as a whole?
Well, for one thing, it can lead to increased crime rates and social unrest.
That makes sense.
When people are desperate, they're more likely to make choices they wouldn't otherwise make.
Of course.
It also puts a strain on social safety net programs.
Right, because more families require assistance.
Exactly. And perhaps most importantly, it undermines our collective sense of well-being and shared prosperity.
So it's not just a matter of, individual responsibility or family values.
Right.
It's truly a systemic issue.
It is.
That requires systemic solution.
Absolutely. And we've explored some of those solutions.
Right. We've talked about reinstating usury laws, strengthening regulations on the lending industry.
Promoting financial literacy.
Right.
Those are all important steps.
Yeah. What else can we do to create a more equitable and sustainable economic system?
One crucial area we haven't touched on yet is the need for affordable housing.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It is.
I mean, when families are forced to spend a huge portion of their income on rent or mortgage payments, it leaves them so incredibly vulnerable to these financial shocks.
We need policies that promote the development of affordable housing options. Especially in communities with good schools and job opportunities.
So creating communities where families can actually thrive, not just survive.
And beyond housing, we need to address the rising cost of health care and child care.
It's getting out of control.
These are essential services that are increasingly out of reach. For many families, we need to explore innovative solutions like universal health care and subsidized child care to ensure that all families have access to these basic necessities.
I mean, these are big systemic changes.
They are.
But they're absolutely essential if we want to create a more just and equitable society.
It's about shifting our priorities and recognizing that investing in families is investing in the future.
The two-income trap really drives home that point.
It does.
That families are the bedrock of society. And when families are struggling, the entire system weakens.
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to have these conversations, to shine a light on these issues and to demand better from our leaders.
I think this deep dive has given our listeners a lot to think about.
I hope so.
And hopefully some tools to navigate these challenging times. Before we sign off, I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier. This idea of reimagining the economic rules of the game. Love it.
It's not enough to just tweak the existing system. We need to fundamentally rethink how we structure our economy to prioritize the well-being of families and children.
I agree.
So if we were to design an economic system from scratch, what would that look like?
Wow.
What policies and structures would need to be in place to ensure that families have the support
That's a great question.
they need to thrive?
That's a great question to leave our listeners with.
It is.
It's about envisioning a world where economic security is a right, not a privilege. A world where all families have the opportunity to achieve their full potential.
And that's a world worth striving for.
It is.
Thanks for joining us
Thank you.
on this deep dive into the two-income trap. We hope this conversation has empowered you to think critically about these issues,
Absolutely.
to engage in meaningful dialogue, and to take action to create a more equitable future for all families.